Want to make sure that you have a decent background knowledge for our trip next Friday. Incidentally, have you all replied to Mr. Booth about the... Can you sort that out? Yeah, basically we need to know...
It's very soon.
Next Friday, yeah. We need to know who's coming back with us, if anybody, to Queenswood in the afternoon. It's a crucial thing, so we don't want to waste money buying train tickets that you're not going to use. So please reply to that as soon as you can. Okay, so before half term, I gave you, in the last lesson we had, I gave you some printouts. You probably haven't got them with you. If you have, amazing. If you haven't, I've put the document that they're taken from into the classroom. But I want you to be clear that we're looking at only certain pages of that document. So we're going to be talking about, I'll be flitting between the two, the Mirror and the Times. We're talking about the industries, who owns these newspapers, what else the companies that own them do, a little bit about the history of the companies and so forth. There are Mrs. Fisher videos and other videos about all this stuff online that you can access, but I would say that they are a bit out of date because she made them, I don't know, about 8 or 10 years ago, and the newspaper industry is ever changing, as I'm sure you're aware. Okay, so to begin with, I've written two names on the board here. Do you know what either of them mean?
Public limited company.
Public limited company, very good. Yes. Yeah. Okay. All right. Have you come across Reach PLC at all in our discussion so far? Yeah. Never mind. We did. Yeah. Okay. I've mentioned it quite a bit in passing when we were looking at one of the newspapers. I haven't talked much about this one, but this is the owner of one of the newspapers that we look at. Do you want to take a punt at which one? This.
The Sun.
No, we don't study the Sun.
That's all right.
But no, okay. I will come back to the Sun though. It is the Mirror, yeah? Okay. It's the Mirror, okay. Okay, so they own, okay, I'm going to do something like a bit like a family tree kind of thing here, okay? They own the Daily Mirror. They also own the Sunday Mirror, a newspaper called The People, which comes out on Sundays, and I think it's still going. It's very similar to the Sunday Mirror. I don't really understand why there are two different newspapers. They're so similar in ideology and content and so on. They also own the Daily Express and the Daily Star. And I need more width here. OK magazine and hundreds of regional newspapers. So if you go to, not anywhere in London, because the main newspaper in London is that giveaway free newspaper, the Metro, but if you go to cities like Liverpool or Birmingham or regions like Wales, their local newspapers will be owned by Reach PLC. Any thoughts about a company owning all of those different news outlets? There's a lot of them, yeah.
Major conglomerate.
It's a conglomerate, very good, yeah, okay. Now, they have sort of branched out a little bit into publishing books. You saw when we looked at the Daily Mirror, there were some books that were being advertised about football or about the royal family, various things that readers of the Mirror might be interested in. But by and large, all they do is newspapers and magazines. So what can you think of a phrase to describe this kind of conglomerate? Have you come across it yet in anything that you've been in, Mr. Booth? Have you come across horizontal and vertical? Yeah? Which one is this? Yeah, I mean, I've kind of led you to it by the way I've written it out on the board, really, haven't I? Yeah? It's horizontally integrated. What does that mean?
They
all do the same thing. So there's going to be quite a lot of crossover between these newspapers. And that is exactly what happens in practice. The journalists that write the kind of most of the news, the kind of short news articles in the Daily Mirror, will also be working on articles for the Daily Star and the Daily Express, and then also filing things away that can be printed on the Sunday in their Sunday newspapers. And they will be writing up articles and creating new versions of them that can go into regional newspapers, because a regional newspaper isn't just news about your local area, it also has the stories that you would see in the Daily Mirror about celebrities or about the royal family or what have you. So if you've got people working on different newspaper titles, you can imagine that when Reach PLC are looking to make cuts, because it's a very competitive industry out there, and there is a declining number of people buying newspapers, they are going to be making their journalists work harder and harder, writing essentially the same news story for several different newspapers. Do you know, by the way, what the ideology of the Daily Express is?
deliver it fast.
Say again?
They deliver it fast.
Because they're called the Express.
That makes sense.
I guess in the once upon a time it would have been, yeah. But as in, is it left wing, right wing? Right wing, it is. Yeah, it's right wing, and the Daily Mirror is left wing. So you've got this bizarre situation where some journalists are writing up a news story, and they're giving it a left wing spin for the Daily Mirror, and then they're rewriting the same thing and giving it a right wing spin, and it's appearing in the Daily Express. It's a weird situation, and this has only started happening in the last 5 years or so, but it's becoming ever more the case. And one thing that has dramatically changed the newspaper industry in the last couple of years is the introduction of AI as well. So we last went to a newspaper conference that you're going to 2 years ago, and I think the guy made one mention of AI at that point. I bet when we go next week he will talk about AI a lot, because what they're doing basically is they'll write a story and they can run it through ChatGPT or whatever and say, make this sound more like a Daily Express story, make this relevant to people in Birmingham, make this a story about that has a link to I don't know, a celebrity that readers of the Daily Star might be interested in, or something like that. So you can see how AI is helping those lucky people in journalism who still have jobs to do all of this work, but it is increasingly stealing jobs. So there are vanishingly few people kind of earning good money out of being a journalist at Reach PLC. They, as I said, newspaper circulation is declining, going down. And there are lots of reasons for that. Advertising is becoming less profitable for them, therefore they can't afford perhaps to, or in some ways they kind of have to fill their newspapers with more adverts, but they're getting less and less money for those adverts. So the newspaper itself is becoming kind of less of a valuable commodity for somebody to purchase, yet at the same time the price of the newspaper is inflating hugely. So we saw when we looked at the Daily Mirror from 2022, it cost 95p. We looked at the Daily Mirror last couple of weeks ago and it cost £1.90. So it has doubled in price in just 3 years. And the circulation, he will give us hopefully the most recent accurate circulation figures, if it's the same guy presenting as last time. He was very good at it, but it sort of hovers at around 300,000 copies per day. It could be less than that now. Yeah, I'd say it's probably less than 300,000 copies per day, which sounds all right, sounds quite good. But if you think that's each one is costing £2, they're making £600,000 a day on the newspaper. You think how many journalists have to be employed to write that, how many people are paid in the kind of production of the newspaper and its distribution. I remember when we first started looking at newspapers at the start of the course, you were really kind of surprised at the fact that this gets printed and every day and distributed and is in your news agents by kind of 5 a.m. the next morning. It's an incredible amount of hard work and expensive work to produce something like this every day, and that really isn't enough money to pay for what they're doing. So where are they getting the rest of their money from? Adverts. So we've covered the adverts. So adverts in the newspapers, and then adverts in the online version of the paper. And we had a look at the Mirror online. Do you remember what it was like? Yeah, in terms of its adverts. There were a lot. They were distracting. It was bombarding. It's saturated with advertising. It's a nice word to use, yeah? And this is off-putting. Lots of people, they don't like the experience of going onto the Daily Mirror website because of all of these adverts bombarding them all the time. So the Daily Mirror have recently, and this is something that has only happened in the last year, they've offered a paid version of their website. So you can subscribe and pay to reduce some of that advertising. Not all of it, I don't think. I haven't paid, so I don't know what the experience is like, but I don't think it would get rid of all of the adverts. But that would make it slightly less of an unpleasant experience to visit. But I'm saying all of this because Reach PLC really is in quite deep trouble financially. They are quite regularly having to lay off, make redundant hundreds of journalists. I think last year, certainly in 2024, over 400 Reach PLC journalists were made redundant. They're quite, the Educast Media Studies question setters are quite fond of asking you questions about newspapers in an economic context. So it's important that you understand what's going on in the newspaper industry. It's an industry in decline, and the Daily Mirror is suffering because, like all of these newspaper titles, I would say probably only OK Magazine is probably the one that's probably the most profitable. But overall, I think the company is struggling to make money, and they're having to find different ways of getting the revenue, branching out into publishing books, lots of, remember we'll go through, lots of kind of cross-promotion of things like these, Mirror travel, so they're kind of branching out into offering holiday experiences, books about football, a book about Kate and William. These are all produced by Reach PLC and the Mirror in an attempt to kind of support the company because they're not getting the income that they used to get from newspaper sales. Another thing that's happening is that they are being sued by victims of phone hacking. I'm going to talk more about phone hacking when I come on to talking about the Times. But essentially, some very high profile people, most notably Prince Harry, have been winning court cases against Reach PLC for in compensation for the illegal way in which their journalists got stories in the past. I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. But that's just another example of where they're losing money. They had to pay, again in 2024, they had to pay, I think it was in the region of £400,000 to Prince Harry. And they reckon that there are lots more people who are in the pipeline for compensation. Okay, I'm gonna start a new board. Okay, so the other thing that I'd written on the board was News UK. So obviously by process of elimination you can work out that News UK is the owner of the Times. So I'm going to do this same sort of thing again. Alright, so we have the Times, we have the Sunday Times, we have the paper that you mentioned, Izzy, the Sun, and we have the Sun on Sunday, owned by News UK.
I don't get that. Like, surely if you're gonna make two new newspapers for Sunday, just make
One.
make one.
Well, it makes more sense in this context because the Sun and the Times are two very different types of newspaper, as you know, yeah? And the Sunday Times would be much more like the Times. The Sun on Sunday would be much more like the Sun.
Yeah. But like, have the Times and the Sun and just have them both on.
Yeah. Why you have a special brand of the newspaper that only comes out on Sunday? Yeah. The Sunday Times has. It was. I don't think they always had an edition on a Sunday. I think it was introduced much later than the Times itself. But it's kind of has a slightly different tone of voice. It's much more kind of. For a start, it's massive. If you buy the Sunday Times, it comes with loads and loads of supplements. There's bits about, you don't need to write this down, but bits about literature, the whole film section. There'll be a bit about motoring. There's all sorts of different supplements that come with the Sunday Times. And there are quite a lot of people that only buy the Sunday Times, and it kind of lasts them all week because there's so much to read in it. The Sun on Sunday is essentially exactly the same as the Sun. I'm going to explain why this exists in a bit when I come, and it's going to bring me back to phone hacking. But News UK is a subsidiary of a company called News Corp, and this is an international conglomerate. News Corp. And I need to get this up on the screen. I can never remember all of these. But there are. News Corp, businesses and brands. So, News Corp also owns things like the Wall Street Journal in America and what else have we got? Lots of newspapers in Australia, which I won't bother writing down. It also owns the New York Post, you might have heard of as well. That's a kind of tabloid paper in America. It also owns HarperCollins. Have you heard of them? They are a book publisher. And it also owns just put, you don't need to remember these, but just to put property companies like real estate agencies and so forth. Yeah. So it is not just a news publishing company, even though it's called News Corp. So what also complicates things is it's a sister company of, and this is, I'd have to keep checking this because they keep changing the names of these companies. Company. Yeah. So it's now called 21st Century Fox. And you'll know 21st Century Fox, what do? They do movies. They also do, you heard of Fox News? Yeah. And all of this massive conglomerate is owned by one man, one family, yeah?
Is it?
And I've run out of space to write his name up there. So his name is Rupert Murdoch. He's actually in the process of passing the company on to his son, who's called Lachlan Murdoch. He has lots of other children who haven't inherited the company, and they are absolutely furious about it. It's brilliant. They hate each other, yeah. You can imagine this is worth billions, absolute, massively affluent and wealthy company. Have you found him?
Yeah, it's also a spouse. He's had a lot.
Oh yes, he's on his 5th wife, I think. Yep.
Yeah.
He's 90 something, 93 maybe. 94. Wow, he's 94. His wife.
Who's his wife?
His
now?
wife is, I would
Elena.
reckon, is 68 or something.
Elena.
He seems to favour
67.
67. Yeah, he seems to favour wives of that age, and I reckon if he survives, he'll probably divorce her soon and marry somebody else who's about 67. It's a very interesting character, very strange and interesting story about Rupert Murdoch. He has been around the newspaper industry for 70 years, I would have thought. Yeah, so he's been working. He's done very well for himself. He is Australian. He first of all started publishing newspapers in Australia. Then he, in 1980, Murdoch bought the Times. In 1969, he bought the Sun and turned it into a really kind of low market, kind of very C2DE kind of demographic newspaper. Then in 1980, he bought the Times, and there was a huge controversy at the time because they thought that somebody who specialised in this kind of low-level journalism shouldn't have his hands anywhere near the Times, because the Times, as you know, is this very historic title that's been going since 1785, and it was suddenly going to be in the hands of this kind of grubby Australian man. There was quite a lot of snobbery about Rupert Murdoch at the time. Anyway, he took the Times over. Despite him being himself very right-wing, he didn't bring those ideologies to the Times. He allowed the Times to remain pretty much centrist, which it has been since. It's slightly centre-right at the moment. It's quite critical of the Labour government, but it's not overly supportive of the Conservative Party at the moment, and it certainly doesn't support the more, the further right parties like Reform. It's quite in the middle. Anyway, here's the point about this arrangement, this conglomerate. Is this a horizontally integrated conglomerate? No. It's vertically integrated because they've diversified into lots and lots of different outlets. So we've got as well as other newspapers, we've got book publishers, we've got property, and then we've got movies and TV. All of these combined companies collectively make the Murdoch family billions and billions and billions of dollars, okay? So what effect do you think that has on the profitability of the Times? Do they have to worry about making a profit on the Times? No, they don't. And I don't think they do. Okay? Their circulation is, again, they don't publish their figures anymore, so the last figures we have are from about 6 or 7 years ago. But again, they were roughly 300,000 copies and about the same number of subscribers online. All right, so not bad figures, but probably not enough to make a huge profit. But that doesn't really matter because they can be financially supported by this vast conglomerate. I don't think the whole thing has a name, by the way. I think you have to call it News Corp and 21st Century Fox. He's kind of tried to split them into two different companies, but he owns both of them. And he can kind of cross-finance and support where necessary to make sure that all of his companies collectively are making him a lot of money. Right, is this making sense? I know it's kind of boring stuff and it's factual, but it's the stuff it is stuff that you need to learn. It's all written down in these documents here. Obviously, I've embellished a little bit. It doesn't tell you about Rupert Murdoch's wives or anything like that in these documents, but it will be slightly out of date because these were printed about 4 or 5 years ago, and things are changing all the time in the newspaper industry. Okay. All right. So just recap where we've got so far. Who owns Daily Mirror? Reach. How are we going to remember that? You're reaching to get a copy of the Mirror. Reaching, yeah. Okay. They're reaching out because they're a horizontally integrated company. Yeah.
They're reaching out.
What else are they owning? Do they own? What are they owning? Sorry. What else do they own? Other newspapers and OK Magazine, yes. Other newspapers, Daily Express, Daily Star, regional titles, yeah, okay. How are they doing financially? Reach? Not very good, no, okay. Why? They're getting sued. And because they are horizontally integrated, all they have to rely on is other newspaper titles. Across the board, people are reading fewer and fewer newspapers. Advertising is becoming scarcer. So that's the reason why Reach PLC are doing badly. And then the Times is owned by
News UK, which is owned by News Corp.
which is owned by Rupert Murdoch. Yes, okay. And because it's a vertically integrated company, profitability is less important. Okay, so they can afford to perhaps take more risk, you might say. Yeah, so we can bring Hesman Howell into this possibly. Okay, I want to talk a bit about this other newspaper that they own here. Although we don't study the Sun and the Sun on Sunday, this part of News UK is really, really important to the whole story of the newspaper industry. So a little bit of a kind of history lesson for you here. In the 1990s, the Sun on Sunday didn't exist. Instead, there was a paper called The News of the World. The News of the World had been going since the 1860s or something. It was a very old and venerable title. But what was happening was, as they were searching for ever more sensational stories to print, journalists from the News of the World, to begin with, but then journalists from the Sun and other newspapers as well, started doing some very underhand activity in order to get hold of these stories. And one of the main things they did was phone hacking. I don't think this exists very much anymore because people don't tend to use phones in the way that they used to back in the 1990s. But journalists discovered that there was a way, if you could get hold of somebody's phone number, and there are lots of ways you could find a celebrity's phone number through your contacts. If you dialed their number and pressed a certain sequence of keys, you could actually listen to their voicemail. And what was happening was that journalists were finding out stories about people's private lives by hacking into their phones and listening to their voice messages. They denied doing this for decades, but it has been proven. Interestingly, they denied it, but anybody who complained about it got a massive payout from Rupert Murdoch, even though he denied that it ever happened. So it did happen, but he had such a wealth that he was able to pay people off and stop it from going to court. Phone hacking was endemic throughout the 1990s and the 2000s as well. The way it relates to Prince Harry is that before Prince Harry met Meghan, he had a series of girlfriends, but there was one called Chelsea who he was seeing, and they managed to hack into his phone and find out things about his relationship with his girlfriend that they could only have found out about in that way, but he didn't know they were hacking into his phone. He assumed that members of his family, specifically his brother, William, must have been leaking these stories to the paper. So that's one of the things that led to the massive fallout between William and Harry, is the fact that he didn't trust William because he thought William was leaking stories to the press. One of the most outrageous things that they did was in 2002, a schoolgirl called Millie Dowler was abducted. Okay, so she wasn't a celebrity, she was an ordinary member of the public, a schoolgirl. She was abducted, and they managed to find her phone number, and they were hacking into her phone, thinking that they would be able to find maybe some clues as to where she was. I presume they would then pass that information over to the police, but they weren't really doing it from a kind of selfless reason. They were doing it in order to try and pursue a story and kind of be the first people to splash the story about what happened to Millie Dowler. They were hacking into her messages, and they were deleting them once they listened to them. Millie Dowler's parents were frantic because they didn't know where their daughter was. So they were phoning her phone all the time and leaving messages. Please, Millie, call us. Got to the point where they couldn't leave any more messages because her inbox was full. Then they called it the next day, and the journalists had deleted some of their messages. So suddenly they were able to leave a message, and they thought, oh my God, she's alive. She's into her messages. Doesn't end happily, this story. She wasn't alive. She'd been murdered. And this was an example of the new when the public found out about this, they were absolutely outraged. People thought it's okay for journalists to hack celebrities' phones because they're famous, they deserve it. But hacking the phones of members of the public is not acceptable. They also hacked victims of the bombing that took place in London in 2005. It became kind of totally out of control. They were hacking kind of the phone messages of soldiers who fought in the Iraq War. It was just kind of totally out of control. It got to the point where they stopped realizing that what they were doing was wrong or immoral. Anyway, in 2011, so 9 years after this happened, the public found out, thanks to an investigation by the Guardian newspaper. They found out what had been happening in the tabloid journalistic circles, and they were so outraged that Rupert Murdoch immediately closed the News of the World, and he started up a new newspaper called The Sun on Sunday, which was exactly the same as the News of the World, but just had a different title. But he did that. I suppose it was quite a clever association. People say the News of the World journalists were responsible for all this. Well, the News of the World doesn't exist anymore. Yes, it does. It just has a different name. Okay, and there's all those journalists are still working, but he was able to kind of claim that it was a fresh start. People still weren't happy with that, so there was an inquiry called the Leveson Inquiry. That took place in 2012. It was called Leveson Inquiry because it was led by a man called Lord Leveson. And he basically had a lengthy court inquiry into the whole practice of underhand behaviour in the newspaper industry, including phone hacking. Other things that they did as well was like going through people's rubbish and finding kind of documents in their trash and so on. So there was all sorts of underhand practices that were going on, and he came to the conclusion that the newspaper industry were incapable of regulating themselves. And they'll explain more about this at the BFI, but just so you understand when they're talking about it, he ordered that the Press Complaints Commission, PCP, needed to be disbanded, and he wanted a new oversight body, which he wanted to be called Impress, which would be basically politicians, judges, and other kind of people who weren't connected to the newspaper industry. They would be responsible for overseeing what was in newspapers and if people complained about the contents of newspapers, they were complained to impress, and they would be able to investigate the complaint properly. But the problem was, he didn't make it subscribed in law that all the newspapers had to sign up to this. So they all decided they didn't want to. And instead, they created their own organisation, which is called IPSO. And that stands for, I always get these words slightly wrong, so I'm just going to check, Independent Press Standards Organisation. It's in this document here, if you want to check it out. IPSO isn't backed by the government. It is entirely funded by the newspaper industry itself, and all the people who are who sit on the board of IPSO are current newspaper editors or former newspaper editors. So the issue that people have is that this illegal behaviour probably isn't happening in quite the same way anymore. They'll be doing other things underhand in order to get stories out of people. But if you were to complain about the newspaper behaviour, you won't get a judge or any kind of expert legal people investigating your complaint. It will be examined and reported on by IPSO, who are newspaper editors themselves. And the whole thing essentially isn't really fit for purpose. So there is possibly that you might get a question about regulation in the newspaper industry. I'll do a whole lesson in more depth on this and show you examples of how you can write about it. But essentially, if you were doing that, you would talk about the history of this branch of News UK, the Sun on Sunday, and their phone hacking investigation, phone hacking activity, the investigation by the Leveson Inquiry, his decision to disband the former regulation body, set up a new one. No newspapers joined it. They set up their own, which basically is kind of ineffectual. It's pretty much a sort of a factual-based answer. You don't really have that much of an argument to make if you get one of those questions, but there's quite a lot of sort of information that you need to learn. The other thing that we might touch upon is instances where people have complained to newspapers about unfair treatment, and one big news story that will come up in your research on this is this. Anybody heard of Hillsborough?
Was it like a thing that happened?
It was a thing that happened.
Yeah, it's like
It was a disaster at a football match, yes, where many, I think it's 96 Liverpool fans got crushed, yes. This happened in 1989 at an FA Cup semi-final match, and a couple of days later, The Sun published an infamous headline. Let's see if I can get it up here. No, sorry. The whiteboard's gone. It's not connected. All right, let's see if I can do it on here. Can't access the internet. Right. Don't know whether you'll be able to see this. The truth. I'll zoom in a bit on here. So this was the front page of the Sun on the Wednesday after the disaster happened on the Saturday. The truth. Some fans picked pockets of victims. Some fans urinated on the brave cops. Some fans beat up PC, giving kiss of life. This was subsequently revealed to be totally untrue. The fans weren't pickpocketing, they weren't urinating, they were desperately trying to save the lives of their friends who were being crushed in the disaster. And it eventually came to light that this story had been fabricated by the police because they knew that they messed up hugely in allowing this thing to happen, so they wanted to turn the story against the fans rather than against any investigation into what the police had got wrong. As a result of this front page, people in Liverpool stopped buying The Sun, and to this day, if you go to Liverpool, you won't find a copy of The Sun in pretty much any newsagent. I mean, you might find it in a supermarket possibly, but anybody who kind of is connected to the city themselves, I grew up in Liverpool, and I know that I've got relatives who, to this day, talk about the Sun as being an absolutely evil newspaper because they essentially made up something that was a complete lie and called it the truth. It took about 25 years before the Sun finally admitted that this was a lie, and they had to publish a second front page. The Real Truth.
Oh, is it
There it is.
actually?
23 years after. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, there you go. You guessed it. Yes. So 23 years later, The Real Truth. Cops smeared Liverpool fans to deflect blame. 41 lives could have been saved, says New Probe. The Sun says we are profoundly sorry for false reports. That's probably the only example you're going to find in the whole of the history of British newspapers of a newspaper being forced to print something, an apology, that was as prominent as the original story. What normally happens is if something is proved to be untrue in a news story, they might correct it in a small kind of one column kind of half-inch kind of mention on page 16 of the paper, buried away in the back of the newspaper where nobody's going to see it. This is one of the few examples, and I think it's just because the threat to their reputation when this was revealed to be the truth was so grave that Rupert Murdoch will have instructed his editor to publish this. But it wouldn't have been the editor himself who thought this was a good idea. He would have had to check with Rupert Murdoch whether it was the right thing to do to publish that apology. That's if you get a question about the complaints to newspapers, we'll have some examples that come from the Mirror and the Times as well, but there's nothing as huge as this this Hillsborough connection. So hopefully some of that makes sense. I would say please read these sheets and just kind of get it all kind of crystallised in your mind before we go. If the day runs the same as it did last year, then, or last time we went, the morning will be dedicated to talking about unseen newspapers. They won't just be from the Times and the Mirror, because there'll be students there who do other exam courses. Everyone has to study newspapers, whichever exam board they do, but other exam boards have different newspaper titles as their set texts. So they'll be showing us examples of unseen set texts, not just from the Mirror and the Times, but from the Daily Mail and the Guardian and the Telegraph and so on. Then in the afternoon, he will do more of this industry audience stuff, which is a shame because that'll be just after you've had lunch and it's really warm in there and you'll all fall asleep. It's boring, but I would say try and prise your eyes open for that bit because he's really good at explaining all of this. Right, good. We don't have a lesson on Friday because you've got something you have to do with your tutors. I will see you again next Tuesday for a bit more stuff about newspapers in preparation for next Friday. Okay, all right.
Wait, you know the regulation bit?
Yeah.
So then, because in essay, would you then go on to talk about Livingston and London?
Livingston and London.
Yeah.
Absolutely, you would. Yeah.
Yes,
Brilliant,
it
yes.
is.
Yeah.
And the tension between over-regulating the newspaper industry and allowing the kind of freedom of expression and allowing news stories to be published.